December 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The air tasted of pine, diesel, and fear. The Western Front, silent for months, had erupted like thunder. Rows of American soldiers huddled in snow-caked foxholes as the distant rumble of engines thickened through the mist. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had begun. For days, icy weather grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Wehrmacht the cover it needed. German panzer columns poured through the fog, blasting across frozen roads, cutting communication lines, and driving a dangerous wedge into the Allied line, a bulge that threatened to tear the front apart. The world remembered the tanks, the forests, the snow. But what no one saw in those first weeks was the smallest miracle of the war, a secret weapon whose power was invisible, whose invention turned physics into salvation. The weapon wasn't a bomb or a new kind of gun. It was a fuse, a proximity fuse, a device so advanced that even America's allies didn't fully understand it, and Germany's finest scientists dismissed it as impossible. When it appeared on the battlefield at the height of the Ardennes campaign, whole German formations vanished before they even understood what had hit them. Prelude, the last German offensive. By mid-December, the Allied army, 500,000 men stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg, believed winter had ended the war. Paris was liberated, the Rhine lay in reach, and home felt close. Then on December 16th, the forest exploded. Under cover of fog, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army struck with 200 tanks, 500,000 men, and deception as their ally. Their goal, pierce to Antwerp, split the Allied front, and negotiate peace from strength. The first days went entirely Germany's way. The weather shielded their armor from Allied air power. The element of surprise was total. In the snow, American units broke apart. Whole artillery batteries were overrun. Supply convoys burned by the roadside. The 101st Airborne fell back to a town few could pronounce, Bastogne, to form a last stand. Artillery units farther west prepared for one final card they hadn't yet played. Truckloads of secret shells fitted with devices so sensitive they were guarded like nuclear secrets. Each one carried a heartbeat that could feel distance. They were called VT fuses, variable time. Civilians would later call them proximity fuses. The science that shouldn't have worked it started years earlier in Washington's shadow, at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. American scientists, dreaming under pressure, sought a way to make anti-aircraft shells detonate not on contact, but when near a target. The solution demanded technology no one thought workable in 1940. They built tiny radio transmitters, fragile vacuum tubes small enough to fit inside a shell casing. Each fuse emitted a radio pulse while in flight, measuring how long it took for that pulse to bounce off a nearby object. When the echo returned within a preset range, the circuit triggered instant detonation. That meant artillery shells could explode within a few meters of any aircraft, transforming air defense forever. Until then, gunners relied on guesswork and timing. Shells either burst too soon or too late. With proximity fuses, they exploded exactly where the enemy was. But this technology was so revolutionary and fragile that its existence was hidden even from many Allied commanders. The risk of a dud falling into enemy hands was unthinkable. Early in the war, crews were ordered to destroy their own guns rather than let one fuse be captured. Only by 1944 did confidence rise enough to deploy them in limited numbers, first in naval anti-aircraft guns protecting convoys from German bombers. The results were staggering. Luftwaffe aircraft disintegrated mid-air without visible hits. Encouraged by the success, American ordnance teams adapted the technology for field artillery. Then came the Bulge, the one battle where saving Europe might depend on something measured in inches and circuits instead of tanks. December 1944. A storm of fire ice storms still sheltered the German advance. Allied planes remained grounded. The Wehrmacht moved freely across the forests. Columns of half-tracks, infantry, and armored divisions pressed toward Bastogne, compressing the paratroopers inside. Sitting on high ground west of the town, the U.S. 2nd, 9th, and 10th Armored Divisions dug their artillery in. Hundreds of 105 and 155 millimeter howitzers pointed toward the forest edge. Their shells were fitted with freshly issued proximity fuses, each no bigger than a fist, each one the result of thousands of experiments. Only a handful of officers knew how they worked. Colonel George A.K. Reed, commanding an artillery battalion near Elsenborn Ridge, wrote later, "We were told these were new fuses with a touch of magic. No one argued, we just fired them." At dawn, December 23rd, the weather lifted. The mist cracked open, freezing sunlight spilling through pine branches. Down below, German troops prepared for another assault across open snowfields. Officers signaled, whistles blew. Entire companies advanced shoulder to shoulder, confident that Allied gunners would need direct hits to stop them. They never reached the line. The first shells burst not on impact, but above their heads, perfect airbursts suspended in the cold. A rain of iron snowed downward. Whole formations disintegrated. Men dived for cover, but there was no cover. Explosions came from an invisible ceiling. German survivors reported shock that shells seemed to see them. To them, it felt like science fiction. They believed the Americans had devised some uncanny radar weapon, a wonder fuse. One captured officer told interrogators, "It was as if the shells knew where we were, as if they breathed." A secret unleashed. For nearly an hour, artillery rained with methodical precision. Each round burst 10 to 15 meters above ground, doubling lethal radius. Units meant to storm trenches instead vanished. When observers reported back to headquarters, officers refused initial data. No previous artillery salvo had ever produced such density of casualties. At Elsenborn Ridge and near Bastogne, attack waves simply stopped existing. U.S. General Omar Bradley, briefed on the results, described proximity fuses as the most important new device in the war next to the atomic bomb. That wasn't exaggeration, it was mathematics. In 1 week, fuse-equipped artillery caused more damage than any airstrike could have at a fraction of cost and risk. To keep the secret intact, American reports referred only to VT ammunition. Soldiers were forbidden to strip captured shells, forbidden even to discuss them over radio. But the Germans understood quickly that something unprecedented was cutting them down. Winter fueled the legend. Rumors spread of invisible field radar, of American sorcery, of devil's shells. Unit morale eroded as frostbite claimed the survivors. Within days, the once unstoppable German push slowed. By Christmas, the skies cleared fully, and then came the second nightmare, Allied planes returning to the field. Tanks hidden under forest canopy were spotted by P-47 Thunderbolts, the road network annihilated. What began as Hitler's final offensive dissolved into retreat. Science saves Bastogne. In Bastogne itself, the 101st Airborne still held, surrounded. The sky, finally open, rumbled with the drop of ammunition and food, and with artillery fire from every direction. The proximity fuses kept German infantry pinned at bay, making every advance suicidal. Reporters arriving after relief forces broke through described snowfields littered with shattered helmets, each blast calculated not by luck but by physics. One correspondent from Stars and Stripes wrote, "It was as if the weather itself turned traitor to the Germans. The clear skies revealed them, and then the shells reached down as if guided by light." But the weapon's true genius remained hidden. Soldiers firing the guns didn't even realize what made them so deadly. They only saw the result, enemy erased in light instead of darkness. The German reaction. Captured. Wehrmacht scientists, questioned months later, admitted they had explored similar ideas, variable time or radio fuses, but lacked the miniaturization technology to survive launch acceleration. Every prototype shattered from the G-forces of artillery firing. They assumed it was physically impossible. The Allies, unknowingly, had achieved a century-ahead leap in electronic ruggedness through shock-resistant tubes and miniature circuits. What few Germans saw firsthand described it as demoralizing beyond measure. Soldiers felt hunted not just by men but by mathematics. "You could not hide from the sky," one survivor said. Afterward, Allied engineers calculated the results. German casualties from VT-equipped artillery at Elsenborn Ridge were roughly double those caused by standard shells in previous engagements. In certain assaults, entire companies ceased to exist within minutes. The Ardennes forest no longer echoed with the swaggering confidence of December 16th. By Christmas, that optimism had turned to dread. German officers who had once assured victory now whispered about devil's artillery, shells that burst in mid-air as though triggered by thought. Soldiers who survived the first barrages were different men. They flinched at silence, distrusted snowflakes falling from branches, half convinced every sound carried another invisible explosion. None of them could see the secret that hunted them. A radio transmitter the size of a matchbox glowing inside American shells. A secret born in fear. To understand why this fuse existed, you have to return to 1940, to nights over London when the sky itself was war. German bombers arrived by the hundreds. British anti-aircraft gunners fired tens of thousands of rounds for a single downed plane. The problem wasn't courage, it was physics. Timed fuses detonated shells before or after they reached their targets, creating meaningless fireworks. When the U.S. joined the war, scientists turned desperation into invention. They were young, brilliant, often arrogant, engineers at Johns Hopkins and the newly founded Applied Physics Laboratory, under contracts so secret their wives thought they built radios for ships. What they actually built were radios for bullets. Physicist Merle Tuve, director of the program, demanded the impossible: a working transmitter that could survive the 20,000 Guy acceleration of artillery fire, operate autonomously in flight, sense a target's reflection, and trigger detonation within milliseconds. The early prototypes always collapsed under launch forces. The vacuum tubes smashed themselves to dust. But Tuve refused to surrender. He ordered new glass shapes, new filaments, until one test shell exited the firing range intact and live. That moment changed modern warfare more than radar or code breaking ever could. By 1942, the device worked. Within 2 years, assembly lines across America produced 22 million proximity fuses, each one handmade, each one more complicated than the electrical systems of some tanks. Cost about $18 per unit, priceless in effect. But secrecy was absolute. No Allied soldier was permitted to recover one from a dud shell. Aircraft carrying fuses over enemy lines were ordered to crash dive into sea if necessary. Roosevelt himself described them as the second most important secret of the war, after the atomic project. Into the Western Front. Until late 1944, the device served mostly at sea. Then intelligence predicted a German counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The timing could not have been colder or more critical. By then, the fuses were finally adapted for 105mm and 155mm field guns, rugged enough for frontline mud and -20-degree temperatures. Generals hesitated. What if a captured shell gave Germany access to this weapon? But Leonidas Dyer, head of ordnance, argued that desperate weather and shortage of planes left no alternative. The gamble was approved. So when German artillery began hammering Bastogne, American gunners quietly replaced half their stocks with shells bearing the tiny stamped code VT. That morning, few of them realized they'd just loaded humanity's most advanced electronic brain into a cannon barrel. Soldiers, see the impossible. American spotters who watched those first barrages could scarcely believe their eyes. Traditional artillery left neat craters. VT shells painted the air with blossoms of flame. German lines seemed shredded by invisible scythes. Infantrymen described snow turning black where blasts rippled in decreasing concentric circles. Captain Alexander Geiger, a forward observer outside Elsenborn, remembered, "At first we thought our shells were short. Then I saw an entire squad collapse without a crater near them. That's when I knew something new was loose in the world." Accounts from the German side bordered on disbelief. Private Hans Rock of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in his journal, later captured, "The American artillery bursts above us, inside the air itself. The wounds are terrible. We can no longer hide in the ground." German field commanders requested smokescreen shells to blind enemy targeting, but it made no difference. The fuses required no sight, only proximity. Every attempt to regroup invited fresh detonations. Lieutenant Karl Krieger, artillery officer near Malmedy, later interrogated, compared it to sorcery. There was no flash before impact, just the air breaking apart. We believed for days they had low-flying planes directing rockets. Only later did we learn it was science. Calculating the unbelievable, how effective were they? After-action reports from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions recorded kill ratios doubling once VT shells entered use. Tests later confirmed that for the same expenditure, proximity-fused rounds inflicted nearly 5 times as many casualties in open-ground assaults as conventional timed shells. Mathematically, it was like giving every artillery battery its own invisible air force. and it required no extra manpower, just the twist of a fuse wrench on the gun line. German morale collapsed faster than logistics. Survivors refused to charge across open snow, even under orders. Fuel shortages, rough terrain, and these new smart shells turned Hitler's counteroffensive into slaughter. Psychology of innovation. What no report could fully capture was the psychological shift this device represented. For centuries, artillery had been a weapon of terror and approximation. Suddenly, mankind had made precision impersonal, machines deciding the instant of death. Soldiers felt it. German prisoners spoke of shells that thought for themselves. Even American troops viewed them with awe tinged by dread. Sergeant Robert McKinney joked, "Our guns got radar eyes," but his diary admitted he worried what such eyes might one day see elsewhere. For the first time, the frontier between human calculation and automated kill had blurred. The turning point. By the final week of December, Hitler's advance stalled. The skies cleared, bringing down Allied fighter bombers, but the truth is that the counteroffensive had already bled out through its own shock. Columns jammed in the Ardennes valleys became perfect coordinates for ranging guns loaded with VT shells. When German armor tried to retreat under cover of night, proximity rounds set to detonate 5 meters above the ground erupted over convoys like a hailstorm of miniature lightning strikes. Nothing could repair momentum after that. General Patton once credited the Yankee Wonder Fuse as God's own artillery spotter. By New Year's, German corps commanders realized the campaign was lost. Fuel empty, men frozen, they began pulling back toward the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge, which had aimed to divide the Allies, instead drained Germany's last armored strength. The secret still guarded. Even in victory, secrecy persisted. Reports censored the weapon's name. Official communiques praised improved artillery coordination. When British troops first encountered proximity fuses shipped for their own use, they were told simply, "Do not disassemble. Do not ask why they work." Churchill later revealed he hadn't known the full details until after the war. Eisenhower called them our unseen thousand-fold allies. Only months later, in April 1945, as German towns fell and Allied scientists inspected captured electronics, did they realize their enemy had been years away from duplicating the idea. The miniature vacuum tubes America perfected required processes even post-war industry struggled to duplicate. Counting the cost. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department estimated that proximity fuses shortened the war in Europe by at least 6 months and in the Pacific by more than a year. The Japanese would experience them later, on Okinawa, where anti-aircraft shells turned kamikaze waves into carnage before they struck ships. But their first decisive proof had come in a snow-covered forest under a cold sun when invisible pulses met human desperation. In a way, the technology symbolized everything extraordinary and terrifying about the 20th century, the point where mathematics became weaponry and precision replaced bravery as the key to survival. When the thunder of artillery finally faded from the Ardennes, the forest lay motionless again, charred trees, twisted tracks, and a silence that felt heavier than explosions. Survivors from both sides emerged blinking into pale daylight as if the world had been remade. And in many ways, it had. The Battle of the Bulge did not just end Germany's last offensive, it revealed the future of warfare. The proximity fuse, small, humming, invisible, had proven that invention could overthrow entire doctrines. For most of the men who used it, that realization didn't come immediately. They only saw the aftermath. The battlefield aftermath units advancing on Elsenborn Ridge in January 1945 found German bodies frozen mid-movement under a sky still hanging with smoke. Shrapnel wounds marked with surgical precision, detonation not beside, but above. They realized these were not normal artillery kills. They were cuts made by geometry. One officer wrote, "It looked as though the air itself had exploded." The 2nd Infantry Division's after-action summary included a line later underlined 3 times by analysts at Allied command. VT ammunition decisively disrupted enemy concentration. Behind those numbers lay a story of disbelief. German medics described covering entire craters not with earth but with winter coats because the ground was too hard to dig. U.S. frontline medics, walking the same path days later, whispered among themselves that they had witnessed artillery that thinks. Psychologists in the Allied Army noted something unprecedented. The weapon drained enemy morale faster than it inflicted casualties. German POWs spoke of hopelessness. Our generals were clever, one said, but they could not argue with shells that saw us. The science spreads its wings back in England and Washington. The scientists who had built these tiny miracles learned what their invention had done. Newspapers couldn't mention details, but word reached laboratories through coded congratulatory messages. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, technicians gathered around radios on Christmas Eve as reports from the Bulge reached them. They heard only one phrase: results spectacular. For engineers who had spent years hunched over oscilloscopes, that phrase carried the emotional weight of victory itself. But even as they celebrated, a question began to haunt them. What had they started? Because if a shell could sense a target and decide when to explode, what might tomorrow's weapons decide on their own? From 1945 to the New Age. When the Allies declassified their technology in 1946, stunned observers realized that miniature radio circuits built for the fuse had ignited two revolutions at once: electronics and precision warfare. Those glass tubes, once secret, inspired post-war radar altimeters, missile proximity detectors, even early analog computers. Engineers who had labored on the device went on to shape the jet and space age. Merle Tuve returned to pure research, arguing that science must never again serve blindly. We proved, he said, that physics can outpace philosophy. The military disagreed. The proximity principle quickly evolved into guidance systems for anti-aircraft missiles, homing torpedoes, and radar-triggered bombs. To stop kamikazes in Okinawa, the U.S. Navy used millions of such fuses, and sailors said the war ended 6 months sooner because of them. Some historians later called the VT fuse the digital ancestor of the smart weapon. It was the first battlefield transistor, a device that measured its world and acted autonomously with fatal precision. German reaction in retrospect. Captured German engineers inspected fragments of the American shells after the war. Many simply stared. Their versions, built under secrecy since 1939, had achieved minimal success. Without industrial aluminum, silicon, or reliable microceramics, they couldn't miniaturize radio tubes to survive the launch shock. When they saw Allied circuits functioning perfectly after being fired thousands of times, they realized the technological gap was irreversible. Dr. Friedrich Konecki of the Luftwaffe Research Service confessed, the fuse was the death sentence of the German night bomber. And there was irony. Germany had created rocketry that touched the edge of space but ignored the power hidden in centimeters of radio wire. Victory had followed refinement, not grandeur. Soldiers remember. For men who fought the Bulge, the term VT fuse carried a quiet sacredness. They called it the guardian angel in our shells. Private Nicholas Santoro, 106th Infantry, wrote home, "The forest looked alive when they fired. Every burst was at shoulder height, and the enemy stopped running. I don't care how it worked, it saved us." To the gunners who loaded them, however, the weapon remained a paradox. They respected it, but feared handling it directly. Soldiers were instructed never to let the fuse strike ground. A single could cost lives. Handling them felt like touching lightning sheathed in brass. After the war, veterans of the Bulge gathered at reunions and still spoke of the day our shells started thinking. Some credited it with changing the battle's outcome. Others whispered that it changed something deeper, the relationship between soldiers and science. Ethical questions in the shadow of triumph. Every technological miracle carries a shadow, and for the proximity fuse, that shadow was moral. In the years following the war, philosophers and engineers began to worry about autonomy in weapons. Could a man wage honorable war when machines made the vital judgments? The VT fuse hadn't aimed itself, but it decided when to kill. Merle Tuve was asked whether he regretted it. He answered, "Regret? No. We shortened a slaughter, but I worry we opened a door that no one can close again." The fuse had succeeded precisely because it removed uncertainty. It turned chaos into calculation, and once humanity tasted that control, the appetite for it never faded. Within a decade, missiles used similar principles to seek heat, sound, or radar reflections, making warfare increasingly impersonal. The proximity fuse had not only saved lives at Bastogne, it had birthed a new philosophy of combat, one where distance meant power and decisions moved from men to circuitry. Echoes beyond the Bulge. In post-war Europe, German veterans spoke of the Ardennes with mixture of pride and trauma. Some still could not explain how their final offensive, carefully planned, heroically fought, unraveled so quickly. They knew weather had played its part, logistics too, but many agreed on one detail. The sky explosions marked the moment morale vanished. Hans Rock, who wrote the wartime diary preserved by Allied intelligence, later stated simply, "Our courage died the day we looked up." Across the Atlantic, few Americans even knew why the offensive had ended so abruptly until declassification years later revealed the secret. When they learned, the reaction was awe and unease. The realization that physics, not fanaticism, had tipped the scales felt colder than the snow through which they had fought. The weight of victory. By the time the world learned how the device worked, the fuse itself had evolved beyond recognition. Solid-state electronics replacing glass tubes, microchips succeeding copper wire, but its essence remained: sense, decide, destroy. And that legacy extends far beyond the fog of the Ardennes. Every radar-guided interceptor, every missile proximity detector, every automated defense system traces its origins to those snowy fields where young artillerists watched invisible waves decide destinies. Those who survived never forgot the sight: snowflakes swirling in sunlight, shells detonating exactly above marching columns, a quiet after each volley, more haunting than war cries. The Germans had begun the offensive with certainty. They had counted on weather, surprise, and steel. What they encountered instead was mathematics, cold, precise, merciless, hidden inside the hearts of American shells. Spring 1945. The snow had melted from the Ardennes, revealing wrecked armor half sunk in thawing mud. The smell of fuel and pine mixed with silence. Soldiers who returned through those blasted woods found fragments of brass and glass gleaming in the sunlight, the remains of proximity fuses that had changed the course of the war. The battle was over. Yet its echoes traveled far beyond the ruined villages of Belgium. The proximity fuse had done more than stop an offensive. It had redrawn the moral and scientific map of warfare. Within that small device, a few centimeters of copper coil and vacuum tube, lay both the triumph of ingenuity and the birth of something humanity could no longer fully control. When the secret leaked, for months after the victory, the fuse remained classified. Allied intelligence feared that if surviving German or Japanese scientists saw even one intact specimen, they could reproduce it within years. Troops were ordered never to transport dud rounds home as trophies. But secrets buried under success never stay buried long. By autumn 1945, when censorship eased, military reporters finally heard whispers about a radio-controlled fuse. Newspapers described it with wonder, an electronic eye in the sky. The truth, when revealed, captured public imagination. Technology had saved Bastogne when courage alone might not have. At first, people treated it like magic, a discovery so advanced it felt alien. School textbooks soon simplified the science for a new generation. Yet among the men who had designed it, the mood was conflicted. They had won the race against tyranny, but also proven that automation could amplify destruction faster than human ethics could respond. The fuse goes global. By 1946, the United States and Britain authorized mass production for peacetime research. Proximity sensing became the backbone of modern radar, meteorology, and aviation safety, transforming navigation as much as it had transformed artillery. Civil aircraft began using altitude-sensing valves based on the same principle. The invisible ping of the wartime fuse now guided commercial planes safely through cloud and night. But in military arsenals, evolution never paused. Engineers in lingering conflict zones adopted similar systems, refining them into radar-guided bombs and early defensive missiles. Within a decade, the philosophy behind the VT fuse, detonate when close enough, grew into autonomous guidance. Seek, decide, act. The line between proximity and intention blurred. The small brass nose, born in the mud of Belgium, had become the ancestor of every smart weapon that followed. The human reaction among veterans, reactions divided along generational lines. Artillerymen from Elsenborn Ridge remembered the device with reverence. "It saved our skins," one said, "and that's all I needed to know." To them, the fuse was guardian, not question. But younger scientists, inheriting laboratories once run by wartime pioneers, saw a different pattern. They realized how the technology's success made future killing distant, abstract, data-driven. What began as protection for soldiers in foxholes gradually evolved into machines that strike continents away. Merle Tuve, now gray-haired, often warned colleagues against complacency. Every improvement in precision, he wrote in 1953, forces a new improvement in responsibility. Many of his students went on to design space satellites, calling themselves engineers of peace, even as their inventions guided nuclear weapons. The proximity fuse had given humanity both laser surgery and intercontinental missiles, two children from the same parent. Germany's reflection. In post-war Germany, the fuse's legacy was studied with both admiration and melancholy. Surviving officers who had fought at the Bulge admitted that their armies had never lost to overwhelming numbers, but to unseen mathematics. It was the day science stopped belonging to us, one general confessed. Historians in Bonn later described the defeat as the moment precision replaced sheer will. For decades after, German universities used wartime case studies of the VT fuse to teach industrial electronics. Professors framed it as proof that ideas, not ideology, win wars. That lesson helped rebuild the scientific culture of a nation once bent entirely toward destruction. Bastogne remembered. Visit Bastogne today and you'll find museums that still echo with the hiss of recorded bombardment. Displays show fragments of brass fuses beside faded photographs of young artillery crews. Guides explain how these tiny bulbs of glass changed a campaign meant to reverse history. Most visitors pause longest at a short quote etched on a plaque from an anonymous German survivor. "We fought machines that could feel us coming." It strikes everyone differently. Some see horror, others marvel. Both reactions are correct, because the fuse represents both sides of human genius, the instinct to protect and the capacity to annihilate. The moral inheritance, modern historians call the VT proximity fuse the first step toward the thinking battlefield. It didn't start the atomic age, it started the automated one. In every modern missile, every drone sensor, every radar-guided defense cannon echoes that same pulse: measure, judge, strike. The lesson, perhaps, is not technological but philosophical. Wars may end, but precision never rests. The more accurate our inventions become, the more they force us to ask whose accuracy they serve. At the Ardennes, the equation was simple: save the soldiers freezing in Bastogne. In the decades that followed, it became complicated. Precision without conscience, distance without empathy. A single spark in the snow. If you stand today on a quiet winter evening near Elsenborn Ridge, the forest still folds around you, the snow muffling every sound. Nothing remains but pine trunks and the far hum of wind, until you imagine a brief pulse rippling through the air, invisible, timeless, the heartbeat of the fuse that once decided a battle. It reminds us that wars are often turned not by strategy or numbers, but by ideas small enough to fit in a closed hand. The Germans expected weather and surprise to protect them. They discovered instead that human curiosity outruns weather, and that one invisible invention could erase months of planning. The last words belong to Merle Tuve, written years later. "We did not set out to make weapons smarter than men. We set out to make men safer than war." But the moment a circuit learned to sense the world around it, humanity entered a new era, one that still asks whether invention belongs to mercy or power. Under the quiet sky of the Ardennes, that question still hums in the air, faint as a radio pulse, eternal as the sound of history turning its page.